Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for showing up, and for those of my LDM class who did not show up, I know you. We'll see about that. Today, we are very, very fortunate to have a person of the caliber of Dr. Jia-Ching Chen, and to give us a talk about city and regional planning in general, and the environmentalization, the rural-urban transformation of contemporary China. Dr. Chen is a visiting scholar. Is a visiting scholar at Brown University and a postdoctoral fellow at Taiwan's National Research Academy. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in city and regional planning, with a designated emphasis in global metropolitan studies. His current book project, titled The Great Leap Forward, Environmentalization and Rural-Urban Transformation in Contemporary China, documents the rise of spatial planning as a sustainability science in China and examines its intersections with rapid urbanization and environmental governance. Dr. Chen's continuing research examines the links between China's domestic socio-spatial transformation and its transnational investments in food, energy, and land. His publications include a recent article in Human Geography and a book chapter on the role of dispossession of China's green development. He is also a guest editor of GeoForum special issue on the effects of rural environmental governance in rapidly urbanizing China. I would like you to all to welcome Dr. Chen. Welcome,
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's very kind of you.
Dr. Chen is going to give us a talk, and at the end of the talk, we'll solicit questions. Okay.
Thank you all for coming. And to Kareem, who is not here, for inviting me here and making this lecture possible. I appreciate you all coming in the last minute rain and for your interest in this topic. I've been conducting this research since 2007 as a doctoral student at Berkeley in city and regional planning. But disciplinarily, the research, as you'll see, transverses some different domains, but does, in its aspirations, seeks a continual dialogue with planners and with designers about practice in China as a really vital and incredibly experimental place for the exercise and practice of these disciplines, and for its importance in terms of marshaling its rapid transformation and development in a more sustainable direction in terms of both social outcomes and environmental outcomes, but also for how its development articulates with and transforms global political economies around many natural resources, and for the outcomes of China's own development and its impacts on global climate change and other vitally critical, important environmental issues that I'm sure a lot of you as designers and as international scholars all recognize. So I'm glad that for all of us here in this room, at least, we don't need to we don't have too much of a question about why China is important and why we should care about what's happening in China, but I'll just rehearse a few details for you. As I'm sure most of you are aware, China is undergoing an unprecedented process of urbanization and development over the last 20 years. This process of urban development and environmental change is happening at unprecedented speed and scale, where new cities, new towns are literally being planned and built every day in China. China's urban population will double between, it's going to reach 1 billion before 2030. It's surpassed its urbanization rate, surpassed 50% a couple of years ago. And the urban floor space will double between 2010 and 2030. And just to give you a sense of how much floor space that is, that's the equivalent of about 650, 660 Empire State Buildings being built every week between now and then. This rapid transformation in China entails massive environmental change. And the depletion of resources and the transformation of the use of existing resources is contributing to a global intensification of what is talked about as the food, energy, and land nexus, where competition for resources that are inherently linked to land and agriculture and not just agriculture, but of course forest systems and other land-based terrestrial ecosystems are in competition with new agendas for environmentalized energy production, for higher intensity agriculture, for changing diets, and so forth. Domestically, China's efforts to create more environmentally efficient models of urbanization in the past 10 years very colloquially referred to as eco-cities. And I call attention to this kind of tension here that you'll see unfold in this work, because the project of the eco-city, the idea that you can engineer and plan a city to function more efficiently, environmentally, through just the gaze of the planner and with a kind of complete modernist attention to detail, as we've seen from history, often fails. And in China, you'll see that there's a lot of exciting experimentation in this vein, but also very much, as history has shown us, a lot to be concerned about. Among the tensions that emerge are the rapidly changing agrarian livelihoods and the transformation of village life into urban life, and the level of dispossession and violent transformation that that entails. Internationally, China's economy has spread throughout the globe. And many of you may be aware that its foreign exchange reserves, the amount of money that, that other countries pay to China for its exports, that there's a massive asymmetry. And in order to deal with this asymmetry, China has increasingly pursued a policy that's known as going out. And what going out means, essentially, is to convert those foreign exchange reserves into other kinds of productive assets. And these assets then become, rather than a cash reserve that has tensions with its own exchange rates and affects its exports, they become a stabilizing and a diversifying aspect of the economy. This is the idea behind the policy. However, I argue that the going out policy is not merely a monetary policy that's focused on trade imbalances and its exchanges, but rather is a policy that is very much focused on state security and, in fact, national ecological security. This is a term used by the central government. And in order to trace these links between China's domestic changes and its pursuit of going out, and how these domestic changes are leading to an increasing amount of going out being focused on the acquisition of land and mineral resources and agricultural capacity. To trace these links, I'm going to first look at a project of eco-city building and green development in China. I'll talk a lot about the process of planning practices and some of its political economies. This is a rendering of a portion of a larger green development program. This is in Jia-Ching, China. And this is an eco-city, a self-labeled eco-city project that included central government support for the construction of a solar industry. And I'll get into more detail about this, but I just wanted to kind of give you the general scope of this project to begin with, so that you have this kind of image in your head. This is actually being built. And between 2007 and 2011, Jia-Ching, with all of these government subsidies, was able to construct approximately 5% of the global supply or the global capacity in producing solar panels. So this is, in a very short time, a very successful project in those terms. Today I'm going to look at that place. I want us to think about the construction of renewable resources like solar panels as we think about any other kind of resource like oil or like agricultural land or any natural resource, where what makes something a resource isn't just its inherent physical properties, but it's the social construction, all the activity that goes into making that thing productive for society. It's the way that we value it. It's the way that there's infrastructure that makes it available. There's the way that there's shared values about how something is used and so forth. And for us to understand then how new goals around sustainable energy such as solar are articulating with city building and economic development in China, in places like Jia-Ching, we need to understand how those things are not providing only incentives, but are materially linked in diverse ways to these places. And that these resource geographies are spreading across places like this, a rice field in Yixing, China, that no longer exists, to a new project of a solar farm in Le May, France, which was built using solar panels from Yixing, but also through development capital that is linked to the development zone where that manufacturing firm exists in Yixing as well. And then, of course, to the social and rural transformation that I hinted at a moment ago. We'll get more into this process of demolition and dispossession more as we move forward. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the national context of constructing environmental values first in China, to look at how those inform place-based development, economic development, and green development planning in Yixing, and to look at the localized impacts in Yixing of these planning practices and the unfolding of these industries, and then the implications for the global food system and sustainability, and then also in relationship to energy sustainability, and then a few conclusions. So moving forward to constructing national environmental values, I'd like to call our attention to the sort of paradox of something that can be termed a national environmental value. Like on the surface, we might consider this to be something that's wholly natural and tied to the environment that's out there, right, around us. But of course, environments don't have national boundaries. And even those that do fall within territories, such as farmland, for instance, they have effects that are not merely local, and they have forms of value that can't be fully quantified. But China's new approach to governing its national environmental security, its ecological security, is how it's termed in its plans, has to do with a concept called red lines. Red lines are nationally scaled resources and targets. So that's a number, an abstracted single factor number, such as carbon abatement, such as a quantity of farmland, such as a renewable energy portfolio standard, target to be reached for the entire country. And again, today I'm going to focus on the application of the red line policy to agricultural land and to a solar standard. But what these quantities do is they create a fungible, an exchangeable number that can be made in policy equatable with this environmental service and value. And we'll see the paradoxes of that emerge as we move forward. And what this quota system allows is for targets or this larger red line is then divided into a quota system. So imagine the targets for solar. These can be allocated to given places, just like in the planned economy, to reach a larger national target. These targets are known as veto targets. This has happened with the last administration, now under Xi Jinping. And what veto targets are, what that means is that local officials and government officials, their promotion, their careers depend on meeting these targets. If they fail, they can be fired. So turning our attention now to how some of these red lines function, especially in relationship to land management. In central policy now, there's a lot of attention given to specific functions for different territories around the country. And this is a map of an idealized spatial structure for China's agricultural development moving forward. And what this map demonstrates is a mentality behind China's planning and behind its central government ideology on green development that is focused on optimization. It shows that this ideology of planning believes that environmental function can and should be planned in particular places. It also shows a real cognizance about finite resources, but at the same time, it strives to make those finite limits something that can be controlled by planning, such that it can be put in the correct place. And a major aspect of that is the replanning of rural land and rural spatial structure, especially in the areas outside cities. Now, to just give you a brief background, this is a diagram of urban and rural space under a given municipality's jurisdiction. So if we think of the larger square as being this municipality, that municipality's seat, its urban core, being here in the gray, and the smaller towns and then villages being these gray circles, there's a kind of cascading scale of construction. And all of this is considered to be construction land. Now, China's land system is bifurcated between rural land and urban land. Urban land is constitutionally owned directly by the state. Rural land is constitutionally owned by collectives. And now we are in a moment when environmental governance demands that the state take control over rural land so that it can be planned for optimization and a better environmental usage. And so what that means is that there's a whole host of social and environmental transformations that take place. If, for instance, farmland is to be converted, it also must be replaced. This has been a central policy since 1998, after its central government responded to Malthusian concerns that followed on the publication of a really widely known book by an American named Lester Brown that was titled "Who Will Feed China?" And Who Will Feed China raised concerns about China's general lack of farmland, that it has to feed 20% of the world's population on less than 9% of the world's arable land, and that development was eroding that 9% even further. Lester Brown really pointed out some very important questions for China, and they responded by putting a moratorium on land conversion. But in the end, as that became transformed into this red line policy using quotas to protect land, to set quotas for each province and then from each province to each city to maintain a given amount of farmland, those quotas began to be traded and consolidated in different ways, raising many kind of contradictions in terms of what was actually being regulated. And I'll explain further as we move forward. Taking this urban space, we can think about, or I would like to show you how actually how rural land is constructed into quantities for the regulation of this national land resource. From this space, we think of an administrative, or this is what happens, an administrative enclosure takes place where the municipality takes direct control over the planning of different rural jurisdictions. From there, there's physical enclosure, meaning people are begun to be evicted from their homes, and village land is transformed in order to prepare it for other uses. And this is considered a process of reclamation or optimization. So if we think about these kind of extensive and low-density settlements being cleared, village land where people's low-density housing existed being removed, that opens up space in rural land to become farmland. That can be replacement land for other farmland that's closer to the city to be transformed to other uses. So this is a generation. This is called a production of quota. And then that quota can be converted and allocated for new development projects that make a more efficient use of land. At a time when there is increasing protest and a perception of illegitimacy on rural land dispossession and rural land enclosure, one wonders how these policies are politically justified and what kinds of policies what kinds of projects the central government is willing to support in the face of potential social instability and massive discontent. One of those projects, and many actually, have to do with environmental security and the transformation of China's development path to become greener. In Jia-Ching's case, this had to do with the master planning of the expansion of China's solar industry, which I mentioned really took off in 2007. You can see these curves. The Chinese production capacity is in red compared to the other major producers around the world. From 2007 to 2010, Jia-Ching established 10% of China's capacity, about 5%, more than 5% of global capacity. Jiangsu, the province where Jia-Ching is, produces about half of China's overall capacity. And China's capacity is going through the roof. In 2012, I'm not sure if these numbers mean much to anybody in this audience, but its estimated capacity was over 32 gigawatts of panels alone. So this is just for old style solar panels. And in relationship to that is the production of solar farms and targets for domestic solar generation. So we have two things. There's a national support of industrial policy as climate policy, right? The support of the construction of the solar industry as an economic growth opportunity, and as an opportunity to dovetail with international policies supporting these industries, such as renewable portfolio standards in other countries, feed-in tariffs, methods for stabilizing the price for solar generation in other countries, and as well as for generating carbon credits, such as those that were issued under the Kyoto Protocol Clean Development Mechanism for this solar farm in Western China, built with solar panels from Jia-Ching. And this is just to give you a sense of China's role in creating global carbon remediation economies. This is just the Clean Development Mechanism under the UN. Through 2012, China produced over 64% of the credits, some of which were for solar farms, others were for afforestation projects, and other forms of carbon mitigation. So going back to Jia-Ching and its green development planning, this is Jiangsu province here. It's on the coast, right to the north and surrounding Shanghai. And the city is highlighted there with a red dot. Jia-Ching's large-scale urban and rural integration began to take place in 2005 with the establishment of a municipality-wide planning program with new towns construction. So the main urban core can be seen over here in the eastern half, in the central eastern half. The southern half is mostly mountainous and is considered mostly ecological preserve. But then you can see these small agglomerations. These are all planned new town projects built around existing townships and villages to concentrate space, as I was showing earlier, to optimize spatial structure. And the policy that this unfolds under is called the three consolidations. And these consolidations are the consolidations of villagers into urbanized settlements, of township and village enterprises into industrial zones, and of small-scale farming into large-scale agribusiness. The three consolidations. And this is a little bit this shows a little of how that unfolds. This is a larger series of projects that encompasses over 330 square kilometers of Jia-Ching's territory, including this larger eco-city project, which you saw another rendering of in the beginning, the remaking of old industrial zones into new green tech development zones. The one shown here on the lower left is actually a part of China's Agenda 21 and was established in Jia-Ching in 1992 following the Rio Declaration as China's first national industrial zone focused on environmental industries. And this has made Jia-Ching a focal point for green development and green industrialization. This is a afforestation belt that is targeted to produce carbon credits under the UN protocol as a buffer between the city and Taihu Lake. You can see it's a monocropped forest. This is really problematic. And these were planned high-intensity agricultural fields that were replacing prime farmland. Now, in China, there's a distinction between prime farmland and regular farmland. Prime farmland is not supposed to be converted under any circumstance. But of course, there are many circumstances that are allowed. And some of those are for the replacement of prime farmland, which is farmed by collectives for subsistence, into something that is industrialized and higher yield. However, this project never unfolded because the political head of the project was promoted to a different zone in Jia-Ching, the one that I mentioned in the lower left here, to remake that project in the image of an eco-city. And now to talk a little bit about what that actually means, about this kind of aesthetics of the eco-city. I think this is something that planners and architects will be interested in. It involves, in China, there's been a rapid expansion in practice in planning and in design that it's hard to compare with elsewhere. I mean, it's comparable with many places in the Middle East, perhaps, but prior to the past 20 years had been seen as something that was really a new type of opportunity, and one which cast the perceived authoritarian power and centralized abilities of the state as something that could be a real asset for green development and for experimentation in green building. Jia-Ching's master plan was undertaken by a Dutch firm called Nita, who's built almost its entire practice not in Holland, but in and around Shanghai. Nita was originally a landscape design practice focused on plantings and so forth in their Holland practice, but they won the design proposal for the Shanghai Expo, which took place under the theme "A Better City, a Better Life," drawing a real kind of ideological connection between greening, environmentalization, and the city, that the city was inherently environmentally rational, whereas other forms of use were environmental liabilities. The previous picture showed, I'm sorry, I didn't mention, NIDA makes its hallmark for its practice what they call regression design. And what they say is that regression design, quote, regresses a site to its natural state, to return it to its maximum cultural carrying capacity. And here they really look at how they believe landscapes are not only resources for reproduction or for production, but for cultural sustaining. And they saw the expo as an important example of this, and they carried this idea forward to their master planning for Jia-Ching. But what that meant was that they wanted to identify what the supposed natural original site consisted of. And this is one example. In their hydrological analysis of some village lands in the area for the eco-city, they identified a few uses, a few land uses related to water here on the left-hand side. In orange is hardscape village land. So they saw that as being impervious and something that's separate from the hydrological system. Of course, water runs off, that has real implications. The green is what they define as being artificial surface water features, such as aquaculture ponds and irrigation systems. And then in blue is the supposed natural hydrological system of the area. And they also identified what they called then water landscape resources and view resources here on the bottom, which they highlight as being around these larger bodies of water, which they identify as natural landscape features. And now the problem here is that these villages had actually all been reclaimed in terms of their construction land over centuries. Some of these villages in this area had been continuously inhabited sites for for close to 1,000 years. And what this means is that all of the landscape features here have a great deal of human intervention, including the maintenance of edges, the removal of subsidence land, the establishment of paddy land, and so forth. It requires a massive amount of human labor and continual management. However, in distilling what they saw as these surface features into what they termed the actual ecological value of the site, they did this analysis and came up with this kind of gridded set of values that are there's arbitrary distinctions between these. And the problem is that these values then go on to inform how and where planned new uses on this land took place. And these, I'd like to call our attention to these kind of arbitrary and very gridded values to talk about the paradox that emerges from this kind of ideology of ecological planning, where ecological values are defined as being inherently linked to land, inherently a part of the environment around us, but at the same time see the value and the contribution of those values to be something that needs to be optimized and planned, and that indeed it should be planned, right? And so what that does is that they say that there's a set of values that we need that's inherently tied to the environment, but it's not tied to any particular place, right? Rather, it needs to be put in place by planning. And to look at some of those impacts now, I'm going to look at some analysis of what unfolded in Jia-Ching. This is a map of Jia-Ching's farmland that existed prior to 2006. This is the enclosure of this area under the economic unit that was overseeing the Eco City project, which is here in the eastern half of the site. This was the designated change in farmland by 2008, and not I'll reiterate this in a moment, but I just want to emphasize that this is the designated change, and that actually some of this farmland exists still, some of it is actually being farmed, but some of it is farmland that is not being farmed. And to get a better sense of that, this is the a snapshot from remote sensing satellite imagery using Landsat to parse the green areas and the underlay of the plan change. So those gridded values of environmental use and originary kind of ecological value see things like farmland as something that isn't tied inherently to this place, but is something that can be optimized and moved somewhere else. However, this kind of farmland that exists in Jiangsu is among the most productive in the country. And it's been shown by soil scientists that the efforts to replace this farmland, they even move the soil from one site to another. That this kind of activity does not create the same kinds of yields under the same farming conditions, and that rather you have to increase industrial inputs to match the yields. Yet these kinds of planning practices justify the elimination of these fields for optimized industrial fields, and the elimination of some bodies of water, but not others, and then indeed the transformation of villages from places of low density housing that had for many years been recognized as essentially carbon neutral and sustainable into settlements like this, where subsistence, livelihoods, and formerly sustainable practices and relationships to the environment were no longer possible. As a diagram, I think about this as being a rural place, a place where land, and in China's development, where the rural meant a bundle of relationships between people and particular places, to something that is being bifurcated, where social relationships and indeed even the environments that are existing in a particular place are abstracted and removed from the land surface, abstracted into quantities of land that can be optimized and planned in modernist processes, and indeed put into spreadsheets for reallocation in new development projects. And so this is, as I was saying before, this is actually land that has been earmarked for construction, but won't be constructed on for some years likely. It's waiting investment, it's waiting for the planning, but it's been enclosed under the auspices of green development. And as you see, it's no longer farmable. Its irrigation systems have been cut. And although the land isn't being occupied by industries or new uses, it's no longer available to the villagers who actually are still today the owners of this land, but they're being paid a compensation until it actually gets sold to the developer. And of course, this has ripple effects. In terms of livelihoods, these are villagers that are no longer, they don't own that land, but they own some other land that is not available to them anymore. And they're farming this marginal land. This wasn't farmland before. This was some marginal land that was then reclaimed by these villagers who've been dispossessed so that they can have a livelihood. Their son works in an electric cable factory that's just beyond that building. This building is an extension of that factory. And they live now in that dormitory but don't have jobs. And they do this for subsistence. And they do this, nominally this is illegal. So their tenure here is totally contingent. This is an image of a new vegetable market that exists on the edge of the downtown area in Jia-Ching. Because local agricultural systems and especially horticulture around grown vegetables has been totally dismantled, new imports into the region have been necessary, and this has been facilitated by the construction of a series of wholesale markets around the edge of the city from where these previous farmers used to sell their products into something where now they're purchasing these commodity-produced farm products for sale in the city. And it's a little bit difficult to tell from the picture, but essentially the same vegetables, the exact same vegetables are being vended by all of these different farmers. And that leads me to talk a little bit about the larger ripple effects into global food sustainability. As China has changed the use of its own farmland and the locations of its farmland, as I said, it's demanded a higher degree of industrial inputs. The red line shows the land area that has been cropped, has been falling, yet grain production is on average increasing. And this is the result of not only a transformation of production, but also in what is produced. There's been an increased focus on wheat, rice, and maize by the Chinese government in terms of giving subsidies to produce these things and putting price supports on these things so that, on these products so that imports will be economically unviable. While other products such as soy, which has gone through the roof, does not receive such subsidies and then therefore does not get cropped. So this is a reallocation of land for basic grains around which there's an idea in China that that is fundamental to ecological and environmental security and to social stability as well. Between just 2006 and 2012, over 3 million hectares of farmland were converted to other uses. Now that's not reflected in this red line because this red line reflects the cultivation of replacement land, right? So when this original farmland was removed, new farmland was required to be built, but it's not as productive, right? And so 3 million hectares, that's about 1/3 of Lebanon's entire land area. And so returning again to the reallocation of farmland to particular uses, China's use of soy has exploded for industrial uses, for creating oil, and over half of which is used for pig feed. So China's diets are really rapidly changing as rural farmers are becoming urban dwellers with more capacity to eat meat. This graph shows the amount of China's domestic soy production in the dotted line at the bottom, and then its consumption, the overall curve on top. And you can see that its exponential growth in consumption has not been met at all by domestic production. Rather, China has gone out to markets in the Western Hemisphere, especially in South America, to meet these demands. In 2012, China's total imports for soy exceeded the capacity of the entire export from Argentina. And just for its industrial uses, it was able to consume and crush all those soybeans. Less than 1/10 of the soy that's imported by China is used directly for food. And this is reshaping agricultural production in the entire Western Hemisphere. This shows the relative production of wheat, corn, and soybeans in the Western Hemisphere. And you can see soy climbing rapidly as others are falling to some degree, and corn is pretty much stable. So in China's going out, it has attempted to actually acquire farmland in different countries. And this is for an intersection between its energy, some of its agricultural energy goals around biofuels and using corn and other feedstocks. It included a massive acquisition of biofuel producing area in Indonesia. It has included oil palm in elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and a lot of soy in Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. Much of this is also for food security. There's a planned increase of 500%, 5 times for grain, basic grain storage capacity and production, from 100,000 tons to 500,000 tons between 2008 and 2013. So much of that capacity was to be met with foreign land acquisitions of agricultural capacity. This included over 1,000 square kilometers of land rights that were purchased in Zimbabwe and required the privatization of that land that is about 5 times the size of metropolitan Beirut. All of these processes have doubled the area of soy cultivation in the Western Hemisphere over the past 20 years. And now, returning back to the conversation about the master planning of the solar industry in Jia-Ching, these kinds of projects were largely able to be successful because of the free land that was given to the government joint ventures and the enterprises under the centralized system and allocation of actual production quotas to enterprises such as the main state utilities. The state utilities were given targets for the production of a certain amount of commodity and for energy. Jia-Ching won the contract to build the solar base for Wodian, which is one of the 5 major state utilities. In trade disputes that unfolded between 2010 and 2013 between the EU, the US, both of whom against China for these kinds of subsidies, claimed that minimally free land itself accounted for 15%, approximately 15% of the startup capital for these companies. Land-based financing, that is rents that were derived from enclosed lands that then contributed to infrastructure and other aspects, total a much higher number. And the effect of these large-scale projects and their rapid development in China that was made possible by rural land enclosure and dispossession can be seen here in the rapid drop in the spot prices for commodity solar. In 2009, this was the projected price for 2013, which then ended up being less than 1/3, very close to only 1/4 of the price that had been estimated by these enterprises in order to be profitable. And so this kind of a fall had multiple effects. Some people really lauded the expansion of the solar industry as something that was going to get us to grid parity. But at the same time, grid parity that is built on the collapse of industry can't be understood as having the same net carbon benefits, right? If factories are being shuttered, if less solar is being produced in the long run by some of these plants, if people's livelihoods are being lost and so forth, these are things to be accounted for by the green economy. These are all projects that were built by, in part with panels from Jia-Ching. At the top is in Texas, this one is in Nevada, this is again the one in France. In California, the leading renewable portfolio standard policy has been put forward by California, which has invested $3.3 billion in trying to set an offset of 2.1 million megatons of carbon annually by 2020. And a number of other policies are related to California's climate mitigation policies, such as a low carbon fuel standard that is seeking to use biofuels to offset the carbon that is generated in the government's vehicle fleet. Now, that standard actually looks at the life cycle, at how the biofuels are produced, including looking at further downstream indirect processes which affect global food systems. when non-food agriculture puts pressures on food systems and demands more land to be converted for agriculture. It's the argument here that solar needs to be subject to the same kinds of considerations. When what had been lauded as a green dream, as the meeting of grid parity, the equal electricity generation price via solar as conventional power generation, rapidly became a massive liability both for the industry globally, but then also politically, as a political viability for the Obama administration in trying to meet, trying to create some momentum behind a climate policy which has yet now failed to be passed. These kinds of liabilities, the collapse of Solyndra, which then sued the companies that are based in Jiangsu for its collapse because of these illegal subsidies under the WTO. These are all considerations that we need to have in our minds when we think about the sustainability of our new energy systems. And so in calculating and doing analysis about just the direct impacts, just the transformation of the land itself from farmland to those that produce solar farms, I found in doing, using soil science from Nanjing Academy of Sciences, I found that the direct land use change doubles the carbon debt for every unit of solar capacity that is created in this region in its life cycle. And what that amounts to is over a 5% loss of its mitigation capacity over its lifetime. So in terms of conclusions, and linking these resource geographies that link Jia-Ching's transforming farmlands to new eco-city dreams, to solar farms and soy farms around the world, for biofuels, for food and other products, I ask us to consider whose sustainability, and to understand that China is not only exporting a solar panel as a commodity, but the ability to be sustainable. These villagers here are at a solar plant in the neighboring province of Zhejiang, another leader in the solar industry in China, for the fluorinated chemicals that were being pumped into the water as effluent from the plant. These were poisonous and were initially not at all acknowledged by the company until these villagers actually physically shut down the plant. It made it impossible for it to operate. In another aspect of life cycle, the production of these solar cells in Chinese factories, they're often not up to the highest of environmental standards and release gases that are much more dangerous in terms of global warming potential than carbon itself. If not properly mitigated, these plants emit SF6, which has among the highest warming potentials of 200 years at over 22,000 times the potential of carbon dioxide, and CF4, the highest potential warmer of known demand, which is at 50,000 years of warming for 6,500 times a unit of CO2. And in a final kind of nod to some of my ongoing research, China's going out policy is linking to the acquisition of other energy and mineral resources. I'm very interested in its investments in oil in Angola in exchange for city building. China is literally exporting its planning practices and labor to Angola in exchange for oil. And these concessions were negotiated in the mid-2000s, around 2005. And these projects progressed very rapidly to reconstruct Chinese cities in the Angolan periphery. However, these political economies of development have major implications for Angola as it goes forth, as its own oil economy, which was valued then at the time of this negotiation, was close to 100, in its budget is at $98 a barrel. And it's less than half that now under OPEC increased production. That has major implications for what has been valued in turn based on that oil. All of this real estate depends on a certain level of rent and value that the government was attempting to control. However, much of that economy is clearly not in its control. And the immediate political economy of construction was also outside of the Angolans' control, as China demanded that all the revenue streams be tightly controlled by its organizations, including building materials. So even immediate inputs for city building were controlled by the Chinese planners. So in conclusion, I'd like to take away three brief points. The first being that resourcing, the creation of any type of resource, has uneven impacts. And when we think about the global industrialization of sustainable sources of energy, there are real place-based impacts in places like Jia-Ching. And that the outcomes in terms of sustainability, in terms of environmental justice, in terms of people's livelihoods are very uneven. And then finally, that China is exporting these forms of planning practice about integrated hinterland and urban planning and tying it to its going out policy and shaping urbanization in rapidly growing places like Angola. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this most enlightening talk. I will open the floor now for questions. Dr. Chen, if anybody has some, would you please raise your hand, identify yourself, and ask your question. Any questions?
Yes, please.
Raise your hand.
Hi, I'm with the Food Security Program in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences. And actually, a question about your last conclusion. You're noting that China's exporting the planning expertise, but the case study that you primarily presented on, it seemed that you were stating that most of the expertise is actually being imported from the Dutch. So when, in this particular case of what's happening in Angola, are they also sort of sourcing it from firms, or is it inherently Chinese, or is your argument that it fundamentally doesn't matter?
That's a great question. There's two aspects. The Dutch influence here really had to do with how the environmental resources were being kind of aesthetically classified in this eco-city project, which had goals of maintaining particular amenities and for creating ecological corridors for birds and so forth. Those were all based on very kind of surface types of analysis that I argue in my written work really is connected to their ideas from being landscape planners and from their practices of being landscape planners. However, the planning in this pattern in China, where urban and rural settlements are integrated, they follow a lot of rules. For instance, the spacing of buildings that you saw in this Angolan project here has to do with the amount of sunlight that can reach every inhabited room for a minimum amount of day on the winter solstice, on the day with the least light. And so things like this, there's a lot of things that are actually just determined in national practice. This project was designed by a state-owned firm that is inside the Ministry of Construction. And so they did all the design, the urban design and the architectural design of each building within that institute, which operates as a private firm.
Other questions? I have one.
Yes.
Where did China, I mean, this is out of curiosity, what happened when the carbon market crashed and all the CDMs?
Yes.
Based on that.
Yeah, the value of CDM carbon credits in the EU market went from something like $20-some when I began this project down to less than half that, maybe even down to $7 at its low point in the last few years. These revenue streams are actually, one of the main complaints by those that are in Annex 1 countries, those that contribute and trade credits on this market, are that additionality doesn't always exist and it's hard to prove. And in China, that's been a notorious problem. What additionality means is that in order for a carbon credit to be issued, you have to be able to prove that you would otherwise have made a less carbon efficient project without these subsidies. But as the markets have moved in a speed that outpaces policy, this has been really difficult to prove. And the incomes from carbon credits are often seen as kind of icing on the cake.
I am Maria Gabriela Trovato, assistant professor at the landscape department. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I think all of us knows a little bit about what is going on in China, but during your presentation, all of the things I knew before from China came on my mind suddenly. And because I work with landscape, I feel really scared about what's happening. I know that the level of pollution normally in China is the highest in the world. And with what is happening now, this pollution will increase. And you talked a lot about livelihood, and I would like to understand better also how these people that had to move from their villages to be relocated, and I didn't understand really well because it seems that most of them are now without a real house, and then why all of these big cities, and are these cities also to allocate these poor rural peoples, or are for new rich people? What's are happening in general in these passages between the rural society to the urban society? And I'm also interested on what is the situation on the borders in between the new village, the new cities, and the other part of the territories. How they are dealing with there is any strategies, and how these ecological red lines you talked about in reality are applied. Because it seems they are interested in ecological value, but at the end they are creating more problem than how they were before. Then everything is a kind of circle that go around, round, round.
Yeah, I think that's an important set of questions. I'll start with that last one, with the gesture of the around and around. Around, I definitely see China as a place not just as being problematic for these practices in this story, but as something from which we can theorize global environmentalization and concern about global climate change, because certainly what's happening in China is not isolated from what's happening in the rest of the world, is one. But two, this process of going around and around and around is something that we can all see. I believe that this kind of red line, for me, one of the easiest metaphors for explaining how this red line functions is a cap and trade system, right? So you're actually in a cap and trade system, you're also only trading and addressing, you're governing a proxy for carbon. You're never directly acting upon the atmosphere. And what this does is that it allows us to continue to create rifts, social and political objects that we interact with, rather than dealing with those things that are most directly impacting the atmosphere, which is to say our consumption. What we're doing is we're creating all these tools and technical solutions, things like solar panel and credits for solar panels that allow us to basically occupy ourselves with changing everything so that we don't have to change anything. That's one. I would say the other questions about the local livelihoods question and the transition are quite complicated. First, people have many different reactions, of course. There's one of the families that I spent a lot of time with and wrote and writing about quite a lot is really divided. There was an older brother and a younger brother. The younger brother, they both worked in the same piecemeal work. They would work for a company that did, they wrapped pipes with insulation for thermal efficiency, and in these industrial zones. And they had been doing this for about 10 years. And the younger brother, he had saved money and was able to buy a house in an older development on the edge of the city. His brother, his parents put the family house in the village under his name. And when it came time to negotiate the settlement and be evicted, the brother refused to sign the papers, and his neighbors all saw that as being a result of his inability to be adapted to the new economy. And so there's a kind of a lot of uneven perceptions about the change. But his parents, on the other hand, I mean, they were also very concerned about his livelihood and his ability to get a new house. The way compensation works is that in this area, it's different for every locality. The way compensation worked in Jia-Ching in its latest phase is that a family getting its rural house taken away had an entitlement to purchase a house of the same area. And that was subsidized by an assessment of the quality of the house and its area. So you have a level of construction quality of the original farmhouse, and then its area, and that's a multiplication that you then get an amount of money that is put against the house that you are entitled to buy. Now that leaves a gap, and so many people actually could not afford to pay that gap and ended up having to move into a rental market, which is a wholly new experience for rural China. And in terms of the relationship between these places, like these kinds of towers, these ones are in Angola, but you saw the similar ones in Jia-Ching earlier in the presentation. Those are all located on the periphery of the city, and they are classified as commodity housing. But at the same time, it's only people who are evicted from villages that live in these places. And indeed, this prevents you from having work in the city were it available. There's not enough employment that's available to all these people. And so this is something that is happening now where previous inequalities that existed in China between rural places and urban places, rural people were totally aware of these things. Of course, they had totally different lifestyles, but at the same time, they had access to a different set of entitlements that was attached to land and subsistence and guaranteed housing. But now what we have is that those entitlements have been removed, and they have more or less access to housing, but at the same time, there's no livelihoods. And this isn't, in the Chinese government view, this is not the goal. This is not the endpoint. This is, this is a part of the process. And the way I think about this is that right now they're basically doing the minimal amount in order to ensure that there's social stability for these transitions. And the idea is that these generations that are right now unable to be employed, there is an expansion of social welfare, a very bare safety net. So an expansion of rural pension, some further access to healthcare, but it's very, very uneven. And there's people who are in very precarious situations as a result. And about pollution, again, this is not the endpoint. So I think the idea is that you're going to be able to have very high modernist plan, improved transportation and so forth. I've worked a lot in replanning of city bus systems around the concept of bus rapid transit in Chinese cities. And a lot of these cities, though, they get it in their head that the most modern form of transportation is a light rail or subway system. And that's what they want, regardless of cost or mitigation factors, air pollution, and so forth. So a lot of this has to do with the kind of aesthetic, environmental value that's ascribed to city building and modernization. There's an equivalency here in the Chinese plan right now. Yes, in the back.
Hi, Hassan from the business school. Very nice presentation. And it's a two-part question. First one being, I read that in October of 2014 that China was going to invest $1 billion in Russian solar systems. Is that true? And if it is true, when's it going to happen? And I saw on the National Geographic channel that in some cities in China people can't breathe properly because of the pollution. And since you can't give them any money for moving houses and stuff because technically you're not taking their houses, is there anything being done with regards to that? Thank you.
About the Russian venture, I don't know anything about that. I'd be really interested to hear more about it, and we'll try to look into it. About air quality, while I was doing field work in China, I developed asthma. And I never had any lung problems when I was previous to that. And now it's recurrent when I visit places like Beirut. But there's the health impacts of air pollution are the total aggregate statistics. A part of it is considered a state security issue. And all the statistics aren't actually available. Yeah, people don't have recourse. In the time that I was there doing my primary field work, I visited Beijing on a record-breaking pollution day, and of course that record has been beat in the successive years. But nobody used to wear or particle masks. And then after that year, they became very rapidly quite common. And so people are very aware of the issues. There's a lot of social unrest about it. There's efforts to report, to put up private sensors, sensing instruments, and to record these and publish them online. And this is having an effect. The Chinese government has put a lot of effort into closing down older polluting industries and to promote better, especially for power generation, coal plants, and steel and concrete plants. That these are, it's difficult because these are the things that are driving the domestic economy. Something that I didn't talk about is that a lot of this pollution and internal environmental problems come from this rapid urbanization. And at the same time, this urbanization accounts for 70% of local municipal budgets. So there's a real kind of political economic problem there. Yes.
When you opened up the conversation, you noted that there's a bifurcation of land tenure, that the rural areas are traditionally owned by the co-ops, and as these populations are being kind of forcibly moved, is the land or the areas that they're being forced to move into, is that land being coded still under agricultural co-ops? Do they still have some degree of control, or is that effectively transferring the land tenure under the urban? Okay.
Yeah. This varies from municipality to municipality, but essentially the village rights to plan the use of the land is taken away from them and absorbed into a higher level jurisdiction. In this case here, in this economic development zone, that was then under the city, but is actually a nationally mandated zone, which gives it different kinds of abilities to promote, to give incentives and to do joint ventures with foreign capital and so forth. But in terms of the land, it often, like I said, there was that dried up field. It was still nominally owned by the villagers. However, they did not, I mean, because the infrastructure for irrigation had been cut off, it was unusable. But at the same time, it was both labeled as agricultural land, which meant that even though it had been enclosed, it didn't require the construction of new replacement land. And so essentially it was being banked, right? So it was like being labeled, we still have this agricultural land. And that's like a part of this kind of cap and trade problem, right? Where the red line is actually regulating the designation and the quantity of the designation of farmland rather than actually farmed land.
Any more? We've taken a lot of your time.
Thank you, I'm sorry I took my
Thank you for, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you all for attending, and hope to see you when we bring in another guest lecture. Thank you very much.